everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
But when you're thinking about how do you solve some of these missions which don't necessarily deliver the same kind of return, the same kind of sort of deliverables that a VC would look for as far as the companies in their portfolios. If we're solving climate change, we have to be able to support these companies who are working outside that, because ultimately, the cost of not doing so is significantly higher for all of us.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. I'm joined by Amali De Alwis, CEO at Subak. Welcome to our show today.
Hello there, Scott. Very nice to meet you today. How are you?
Very nice. Thank you. You studied manufacturing engineering at the University of Birmingham. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that experience.
Yeah, so I guess I was one of those kids who always had a bit of a left brain, right brain argument. So I loved building things, and I didn't really mind actually whether that was building little waistcoats for my Barbie dolls or a radio set to bug my sister with. But I like building things, and I love technology, which is kind of, I guess, what led me to studying engineering. Birmingham's a really great university, as far as it's an old red brick engineering department. And yeah, had a great time just sort of really getting to know how do we actually get through manufacturing processes? How do we build things? And what's the thinking process behind building something? How do you even start that process? And what do you need to think about when you go through to production and through to point of sale as well?
Yeah, so as you're learning about some of the fundamentals of product development that deals with tangible products, aside from the actual mechanical components, did you also get into firmware and some of the software as well?
I did a little bit of software, but not a huge amount. And I've got to be honest, my coding skills are not amazing. I do have some basics. My first language was Fortran, which I wouldn't recommend as a first language for anyone, to be honest. But I think that idea of how do we actually write software, how do we think about creating code, the syntax behind that, and just understanding the basics so that you can actually think about how we create the world around us these days. We all carry supercomputers in our pockets. I think that's a fundamental skill for anyone. So that was really helpful for me, certainly.
Well, I think if we look at the entrepreneurial landscape for the last 20 years, I would say that SaaS and in particularly software has really been kind of the big picture. But I think in the last 5 years or so, we've started to move towards what we consider kind of deep tech, where it converges into the actual physical component, the firmware, the software. And it's really all those different disciplines, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, software, computer science, all coming together. And I wonder why that is so important and why now, when we've been so focused on cloud and SaaS.
I think in a way, we've gotten to the point where software is just, it's ubiquitous, right? Everything involves software. Your car involves software, your toaster involves software. And it's also helped us to drop boundaries between the hardware and the software. It's not something separate anymore. You can create the two, and the sort of the way to actually build something using the two sides is much easier than it used to be. And I think obviously the shrinking of size of silicon has played a big part in this as well. So things which we previously wouldn't have necessarily been able to think about as incorporating software suddenly can. And you can have smart objects, thinking about IoT, thinking about edge computing. So it allows us to really liberate how we think about creating products and services and kind of, I guess, draw a much more fluid line between the two sides.
So we're going to get into, of course, a lot more around, code first, girls. However, I wonder in the kind of the new landscape, and again, I'm talking about things like electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, flying vehicles, space, rockets, launch, satellites, things that we're really starting to see where, again, that multidisciplinary approach is becoming a requirement, and how your organization is going to play a role in not just supporting the computer science and software engineering component, but some of the other aspects and disciplines that's needed.
So this is as far as Subak is concerned, thinking about how we incorporate software on that side. I mean, all of our businesses are actually data-led businesses, and obviously software is just, again, another big part of that. And I think, fundamentally, software is about writing instructions to get machines to do something, whether that's calculating things, moving, whether that's, thinking about how, we drive our cars or live our lives or communicate. All of those elements play a part in that. So I think in a way, when we're thinking about software, it has moved from being something which is separate to being something which is just a backbone of everything that we build these days. And it's something certainly I used to say at Codefest Girls almost every day, which is there's no such thing as a non-tech business these days. It's just so much a part of how we live our lives that I don't think you can even extricate it anymore. To build, to innovate these days is to write code, to drive technology. So yeah, lots of exciting opportunities there.
And actually, I kind of misspoke. Before the current organization that you're leading, which is Subak, you were part of Code First Girls, and I wonder how that was different, because I think in 2022, there's a lot of for-profit and nonprofit organizations that's focused on STEM for women and girls.
Code First Girls was absolutely sort of had that same focus in that we were supporting women to get into the tech industry. I think the thing that we did, which was a little different, was that we tried to do something which reduced barriers to nothing. We ran courses for free, in addition to paid courses, which you could come and join. But when we were talking about young women of employable age, those at 18 to 23 kind of age, and the type of age where you're deciding what career you want to have, we created Code First Girls, and I joined as their first chief exec to build it out, because we found that young women were being held back. So the world was changing around them. All of these jobs in industries, regardless of whether they were quote unquote tech or not, required some understanding of software. You don't need to necessarily be a developer, but you need to understand the fundamentals because it fits into everything that we do. So that's why Code First Girls was really successful. We had no barriers to entry. You could come and join for free. We created a really strong community around that. And we didn't do this as, I guess, a lot of traditional education institutions sort of would do that. We didn't have exams. There were no tests to do. We just helped people to build things, and we allowed them to do that in a supportive community. And it was really incredible because, what we started as, just a few dozen sort of, young women going through courses. By the time I had left Code First Girls, we were just going through our barrier, which was having taught 20,000 young women how to code for free. Code First Girls, as a tiny not-for-profit, was teaching more young women to code each year than we're going through the British higher education system doing software degrees. So I think it was a real learning to sort of see how, the right product put in the right place at the right time could really inspire a lot of change in people and allow people to make sure that they had those right skills so that whatever they went on to do, that they were actually fit for modern work and modern careers.
Well, I think that was a terrific experience. And again, I think the fact that it had zero barriers to entry meant that there was really open door for everyone to participate. And I wondered how that experience has prepared you for Subak, and what is Subak?
Yeah, so Subak is a not-for-profit focused tech accelerator and data cooperative focused on climate change. And it was interesting. I was actually having a chat with someone earlier today and drawing those parallels between the two jobs. And I think the thing which I really take from Code First Girls, I guess, into Subak is that this is all about driving societal change, changes in behavior, changes in attitudes, changes in how we live our lives. And one thing which from Code First Girls, I think we did really successfully was create a cascade effect. And this was around saying, look, it wasn't just about what we were doing with people directly. It was what we were then helping them to go on and be able to do. And that's something which is really at the heart of Subak as well, as a community-led organization, as much as it is a data-led organization, which is to say, we want to help these young companies who are building these incredible products and services to think about not only what they're doing, but think about how they can then support others in the ecosystem. How can the data that they're generating or providing or analyzing be used by others to help solve some of those really big problems? And actually then the sum of the whole, where everyone's working together, where those barriers are dropped, and people aren't sort of hoarding information and working sort of openly and collaboratively, actually you get something really extraordinary out, which when you're thinking about climate change especially, this is a big issue. We have a very short time frame to address it. And that kind of old adage of, I'll sit and do something and sit on the IP for a decade, it just isn't going to work. We need to solve problems and solve them quickly. So we need to be able to share and actually share knowledge in order to be able to do that and achieve success much quicker.
Now, there's an organization I'm forgetting for the moment. I think I was there at Oxford a couple of years ago. The organization was founded, I think, out of Stanford, and it's really oriented towards not-for-profit causes. And again, forgetting the name, but why the not-for-profit model and versus more the traditional kind of accelerator model?
Well, we run an accelerator as well, but it's a not-for-profit accelerator. So we offer grant funding. So the companies who join our accelerator, it's a 3-month intensive program followed by a 9-month build afterwards. We offer up to £110,000 for each of those companies, and they're mostly sort of pre-seed stage of development. But this is strings-free, equity-free funding. These companies can come and join and obviously get a lot of support in a classic accelerator way. And for me, my previous job prior to coming to Subak was actually as managing director of Microsoft for Startups. And we used to run similar types of programs, Microsoft Scale Up program, their AI for Social Impact program. So the fundamentals are still there as far as helping businesses build businesses which are standing on their own 2 feet, maybe generating income, whatever their way that there is. The only difference is how they think about funding their business and taking that funding from non-equity sources rather than equity sources. That's not to say that there isn't an absolute place for the VC industry, for private equity, and for all other kinds of equity financing. But when we're thinking about not-for-profits areas, we have to recognize that some of these companies, some of these challenges just don't fit the mold of a traditional VC fund would need. They may not offer the 10x returns. They may not offer the returns in the time frame that a VC fund would need to return capital. So helping those companies to operate as not-for-profits is really about saying, let's help them to focus on their mission. Let's also help them to build solid businesses. And some of these businesses will be revenue generating. It's just more what they do with that revenue that makes them a not-for-profit, so that money gets plugged back into either their company growth or into their mission itself. But they're still building robust businesses.
Again, I think your explanation makes perfect sense. I think typical for-profit accelerator model is going to really be looking at things like sustainability, for instance. So how are they going to be revenue sufficient versus having to continually go out there and open their hand for giving and philanthropy, for instance. So how are these programs or projects evaluated? And it's again recognizing that triple bottom line may be a little bit elusive for some of them. How do you measure the merit and the viability of some of these?
Actually, there's an awful lot in common. So when we talk about our recruitment process, and we've actually just gone through a round of recruitment for our next cohort, which we're kicking off at the end of the month, which we're really excited about. But the types of questions we ask them is, so tell us about your product, tell us about your team, tell us about how you're solving your mission. What is your technology stack like? How much funding have you raised to date as far as grant funding? What's your runway? How are you thinking about generating business for the coming year? How are you looking at sustaining your business? What might be the data project that you're going to be submitting as far as the data co-op, and how are you going to make use of that? How are you going to partner with that with other companies or with other organizations to kind of make use of that? So these are very common things that I used to certainly ask even when dealing with sort of B2B SaaS startups. Just sensible, where is your business at? I think the bit which is additional to that is, what is your climate impact? And so this is really around saying, it's not just about obviously building a good business and, having a revenue stream, but what are you doing with that? How are you making a difference? And in effect, I guess, the climate is your customer. How do you make sure that they are getting what you are trying to deliver and kind of getting some sort of tangible outcome at the end of that, which obviously, as far as climate companies goes, can really vary. And, thinking about our companies, we have companies who are dealing with, carbon sequestration. We have companies who are looking at, output from factories and energy generation. We have others who are looking at EV, infrastructure. So a whole range of them, but a lot of common ground, I would say, compared to just any other tech startup, just with that additional bit, which is, what's the impact they're going to have at the end of it?
Well, I think, just taking a step back is that, even in a capitalistic society, there are market inefficiencies. So a traditional capitalistic approach to VC accelerators are still going to leave gaps, specifically when we're talking about public goods and public domain that really isn't efficiently addressed by the public sector, like the government or hybrids or the private sector. And that's where the nonprofit NGOs come in. But I wonder if evaluating them according to the same yardstick and metrics of a private for-profit programs is the right approach. Again, recognizing that the impact measurement is around climate change, but the issue is nonprofit, for the most part, it's a constant struggle to sustain revenue or income source or grant source or foundation source, I should say. And then the other thing is there's a bit of cannibalism in the sense that there's only so many that you can actually support, and there's a finite number of supporting or benefactors or foundations. So how do you actually support a vibrant system that meets some of these market inefficiencies, but in such a way that all of them are going to be thriving and making an impact? And keep in mind, when we talk about climate change, it's not just a local, regional issue, it's a global issue.
Completely agree. And I think this is where, so breaking down, I guess, some of those points there, this is where Subak focuses. It's not just with non-profits, it's also with not-for-profits. And I think the distinction there for us is really to say, if you are a non-profit, that's mostly people who are operating, let's say, in the charitable space, where you are restricted as far as how you can generate your revenues. That's usually purely donation-based or grant-based. And definitely not-for-profits get their money from those sources as well. But a not-for-profit can also generate revenue from other income. It can sell products and services. I mean, we were one of our fellows, for example, who's building a really amazing company called the Ribbit Network, right? And as you can imagine, it's frog related. It's a little frog sensor, but it's basically a commercial sensor which you can buy as a consumer to make. You can build it with your kids if you want to in your home, but it allows you to basically look at emissions within your home landscape, and then the data from that, you can actually see what happens to that over time. You can upload that data into the system. That data is aggregated so people can actually monitor globally what data is being kind of, how those levels are differing across different cities and different areas. So that's where, that kind of not-for-profit becomes really, really helpful as a mechanism, because it doesn't mean that these companies can't generate revenues and can't build sustainable businesses. Thinking about the non-profit specifically, it is sometimes a challenge. And, I think, whilst we don't have the same dialogue, I guess, around, 10x returns and, it's a, multi-billion-dollar fund and stuff, that the amounts of money which are available here are getting significantly bigger. So in fact, for example, the fund that we get our money from, it's a climate fund. That's a 9-figure fund, and they're just starting out. They're looking to increase that going on. The Microsoft, climate fund is $1 billion fund. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is another $1 billion fund. The Amazon sort of climate fund is another billion. So we're seeing an awful lot of money which is actually going into grant funding to offer that alternative to the equity landscape. And I don't think that it's a case of even either or. Different things are right for different types of businesses. But when you're thinking about how do you solve some of these missions which don't necessarily deliver the same kind of return, the same kind of sort of deliverables that a VC would look for as far as the companies in their portfolios, if we're solving climate change, we have to be able to support these companies who are working outside that, because ultimately, the cost of not doing so is significantly higher for all of us. And I would say, this is one of the reasons I came to Subak, which is, saving the planet is quite literally the biggest thing that we need to be doing these days. If there is no planet in 50 years time or 100 years time, there is no VC, there is no equity investment. We have to solve these problems. And this is one way to do that, which is by helping businesses to build where they can be innovative, but also help them to build really good businesses, which is where Subak came in as far as the accelerator goes as well.
Well, I certainly believe that, some of these foundations, as well as the corporates that are channeling grants and non-equity based allocation is important, because, if you look at two private case studies around, let's say, 5G or even COVID vaccination, for instance, the indigenous, the people that are in least or developing nations really haven't had those opportunities. And really, when it comes to climate change, it's going to be the same thing unless you have different models. Can you share maybe 3 possible projects or companies that are working in this space? What are they exactly doing? I know you mentioned one, for example. What are others doing, and how are they helping with climate action?
Yeah, and I'd love to share. I mean, a little bit biased in this, but I'd love to share a couple of our members, actually, companies. So, for example, we have one of our companies which is called Ember, and they're basically looking at coal emissions globally, and they've done some really incredible work looking at the data around where those assets are based, who's putting out different types of CO2 levels, and one of the big things, for example, they were really instrumental in helping to drive policy change in the UK government around gas boiler usage. And actually our transition to moving off gas in household is based on a lot of input from them. They've also been doing a lot of stuff around looking at sustainable finance, green financing, actually, and looking at some of those assets, which, we're seeing a huge amount of money going into green funds. not all of those fund assets are actually as green. So they do a lot of investigation to look at which of those are actually legitimate sort of, green funds, and actually which of those are maybe greenwashing certain areas. And again, to make sure that, investment can go into the right places and that people know what their money is going into. We have companies like Climate Policy Radar, who are basically looking at aggregating actually all climate policy from global sources, so that when we're thinking about sort of governments trying to make decisions, they can actually just understand, look, where do we start with this? How do we actually get some really good practice from other companies and actually be able to, from other countries, and be able to actually put in place the right policies without having to sort of repeat things over and over again. And then another company, for example, who is joining our new portfolio, which is called Project Canopy, really, really incredible, very early stage company, but they're basically looking at rainforest deforestation in the Congo basin. And when we think about actually, the DRC, this is a single country which is, I think, about the same size as France and Germany combined. It's a gigantic country and has some of the very last bits of rainforest, which are actually a carbon sink to the world. And obviously, there's a huge amount of illegal deforestation which goes on. So they're using satellite imagery to actually look at where deforested roads are being created, where logging is occurring, to be able to then in effect work with local governments as well as local organizations to address those issues, to address some of those changes, and make sure that they're actually saving as much of that as they can to obviously mitigate climate change going forwards as well.
Well, I think listening to some of these examples, there's several things that come up. One is that in some cases they're playing a kind of a forensics role. In other cases, they're effectively augmenting the academic or scholarly research and the number crunching. But it's this notion of kind of third-party neutral validation, and it's digging deeper, that perhaps maybe the public sector or certain government entities may have a difficult time, and being able to actually work with these kind of private-public partners to be able to actually really kind of look at the truth, so to speak, including for appropriate pricing and risk measurement and accreditation purposes for securitization as an example. Now, there are, I wonder, how are some of these not-for-profit and NGOs cooperating with research organizations so that they're not reduplicating some of this work that's already happening?
So this is where actually the data co-op side of Subak really comes into effect. So whilst our accelerator is focused on not-for-profit climate change organizations, and again, our data theme goes throughout, the data co-op is actually open to everyone. So you can be a for-profit, a not-for-profit, you can be a large, small, whoever you are. But it's based on the premise of saying, look, if we're trying to solve problems at speed, we need to be sharing information, right? And some of that information might be behind, commercial licensing agreements. Some of it might be open source. We don't mind. Just tell us what data you have and allow us to map it. So it's not that we take the data sets off people. What we do is we take the metadata from those, for the tags, for the information, to allow people to basically say who has what data in what form, and a little bit about what that data is. So it's a data catalog effect, which is at the heart of that. And this is really around that point of how do we bridge that public-private divide and help us to actually answer some really pragmatic, practical questions around how to address certain challenges around climate change. So, for example, my head of data and I were bouncing some ideas the other day, and we were thinking about, I had read a newspaper article which was talking about how one of the big challenges we have around EV is logistics, right? Thinking about lorries, right? So there aren't a lot of lorries which have batteries of the suitable size, of the suitable budgets to allow them to be used for appropriate shipment over land. And obviously, the UK does a lot of shipment into Europe and that side of things as well. So imagine what we can do if we can take, for example, EV charging point data and then combine that with data from one of the big retailers like Sainsbury's or Tesco's to look at where their logistics go, what type of year do they have, what types of load, combine that with data about the actual hardware, the battery length, the amount that people can drive, the requirements of legislation for drivers to stop. You can suddenly start looking at a really, interesting picture around if we want to move to a place where we can use EV lorries in a practical way? Where are the gaps? Where do we need more infrastructure? Where does the technology need to be better? And then suddenly you can start sort of creating some expectations and some goals for those private sector organizations as well as the public sector ones to actually build towards an outcome which can help us to deliver to those outcomes. So those are the ways that we're kind of, really getting excited about how that data co-op works. And we bring on board, obviously we map data from our fellows, from our members, but we're also bringing on board third-party data as well. So, for example, last week we just brought on board national grid data, which again, looks at grid infrastructure in the UK. So we're really excited about that. Our beta went live about a month ago. We'll be doing the big public launch, in about May. But yeah, hopefully, we should have some really exciting opportunities to actually support people to do some very interesting things with data. And from the Subak side, not only are we obviously making sure that people know what this data is and where it's available, we're going to be actually incentivizing people to do stuff with it. So we do actually have funding available for people to do data mashups. So if you're an organization who's one of our members and you want to do, let's say, taking those data sources, for example, and undertaking a piece of work like that, we can offer you funding basically to do that with another partner, whether that's a member, a fellow, or a third party externally as well.
Well, this is a very interesting topic because for decades, I think different governments have tried to foster open data initiatives, and this is specific to government data, county, municipal, and so forth, to surface it up so that it becomes more available to the public. And this is exactly how the Tube apps and so forth came about as a result of that. However, it's also gone through some challenges over the years because of because of privacy issues, GDPR compliance, and so forth. So in that regard, I wonder how some of the best practices that's happening in the private sector is coming over to this type of a open data initiative, in the sense that the data doesn't have to all be placed into a single data mart or data warehouse. You can actually maintain those in those safe repositories, but still be able to actually have, whether it's homomorphic encryption or different types of things where you don't necessarily have to have the original data set, but you can run queries or you can get results in computation and you get the results back without actually seeing the raw value of it, for instance. How can that happen? And how can you, from a substance point of view, facilitate that kind of an exchange?
Yeah, and it's a really important issue. And I think, when we think about the data co-op, for example, we're not just dealing with, we're mapping data, but we're not hosting data. So if you have a data source, which is basically shared data, for example, rather than open data, that organization can still have a conversation with whoever the provider of that data is around a commercial agreement. And this for us is really important because, rather than that organization who's trying to get that data, having to repeat that data, spend huge amounts of doing so, they can come to a licensing agreement to actually do that. Thinking about the privacy side of things, this is where work with some of our partners, so people like the ODI, which is the Open Data Institute in the UK, becomes really, really helpful. And I think there are lots of lessons to be learned actually from, for example, in the UK, the opening up of financial data, which, one could argue is probably some of the most sensitive data that you can have about something. And there was, a huge amount of reluctance going back sort of 10, 15 years for banks to open, quite rightly, sensitive information about their customers. But they have gone through that process. In the UK, certainly, I can open up my banking app and see all of my other account data, which is being fed in. So I think there's a lot to be learned from that as far as, how do we keep that information private, confidential, accessible to the people who should do? How do we make sure that we have the right consent levels, the right licensing agreements in place? But also, I think from a commercial standpoint, the lesson which has been learned for the commercial entities, which is to say, just because you make your data either shared or openly accessible in whatever the correct way it is, it doesn't mean that you will necessarily, you will lose revenue. And this is something that we saw certainly with the financial sector in the UK, that democratization of data, that enabling different financial institutions to share data across actually lifted all of them and has obviously driven huge growth within our fintech sectors within the UK. And all of that has been facilitated by open data and, sharing of data in the right way.
Well, I think underneath all these conversations, there's just a lot of complexities, and it just, whether it's legal, whether it's compliance, whether it's privacy, it's just really difficult to navigate. But with that said, I think going back to our early conversation is that if you leave it to the private companies, the way they perceive and kind of make decisions is really kind of their kingdom of their corporate entity and their quarterly earnings. If you look at the public sector, it's really their public domain and their set of mandates. You guys come in and with your with their acceleration and these not-for-profit entities, they can actually start to be the bridge and create value that wasn't there before, and be able to help connect the dots that nobody else was willing to do. But they're willing to do that. And I think when it comes to climate change, you really need that. Now, with that said, again, I think from a practical implementation, it's a lot more difficult. So going back to the example of Congo, it's one thing to get satellite imagery, and there's a lot more satellite capabilities and sensors that's coming up online, but it costs money. It costs money to run those satellites, those constellations. And it takes a lot of computational power to be able to sift through and get results from that. So how do these small little entities do a lot with less? And beyond the acceleration program, what's available for them afterwards?
Yeah. And I think is a really valuable point. And to the point about even things like satellite data, it's actually extraordinary. It's so astonishing how much access you actually have out there. And there are large not-for-profit organizations who actually offer, pay for licenses and access to this satellite data to enable other organizations to basically do work off it. So part of our job is to help people navigate where some of those partners are, what are the types of things that they can do. But even to those who aren't sort of signed up to these types of services, I think one of the really important things is thinking about where the mutual gains are for both sides. When we were talking about an example earlier about, let's say, EV charging points and commercial data from a retailer, if there is a benefit to that retailer, which we're basically saying to them, look, we will run analysis which will help you to prepare for your business to be fit for the future. I think there's a really strong sort of mutual incentive there to actually offer some sort of partnership. And that's one of the things that we're obviously doing, which is developing some of those partnerships to help these small companies to navigate. And I think this is where Subak, hopefully, we're still a young organization, but, when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about, especially within the not-for-profit sector, it's still a very disaggregated market. It's still very widespread. We have a lot of small operators. And this is, I guess, the community part of Subak, which is how can we act on behalf of those small organizations to form some of those relationships, to get some of those partnerships, to act as a proxy, to help them, understand how to navigate those types of relationships. And it's very similar, I guess, in a way to where I used to work with Microsoft, advising B2B SaaS businesses how to work with large commercial clients. There are things that you can teach these young companies on how to navigate that environment. But additionally, how do we actually help them to make sure that, they're understanding what to expect from those kind of relationships, and to offer some sort of value back to those organizations as well, so that they see an incentive to actually participate in that activity.
Well, I really admire and appreciate the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And I've been joined by Amali De Alwis, CEO at Subak. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Scott.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.